topic, of course, is exactly that which is posted here on the PowerPoint. And it's one that's intrigued me for a long time, because it strikes me as something of a bicultural person. Having spent many, many years in India, living with Tibetans, and a lot in Europe, and here as well, that something seemed to have fallen through the cracks, especially since the Second World War. And that is, and during the rise of the Veterans Administration treating psychologically damaged people from the Second World War, GIs and so forth, something that seems to have fallen through the cracks is the development of a very well-elaborated, clear, compelling vision or theory, model of mental health as something other than the mere absence of mental disease. So one indicator of that, one of my more memorable brief conversations was back in 1989 during one of the Mind and Life conferences with the Dalai Lama, which I've served as interpreter since 1987. I spoke with the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. He was a psychiatrist, obviously a person of great repute, and so I thought, well, what better person to ask? How do you define mental health? How do you understand it? And he turned to me with a rather quizzical look and said, well, we don't know, we don't have enough data. And of course, I mean, there is a lot of data, and of course there are many mentally healthy people, but it's only, from my understanding, only more recently, the last 10 years, with the work of Martin Seligman, John Haidt, who I understand is here, and other people working in this field of positive psychology, that people are really kind of putting on their thinking caps and thinking how to envision something of mental health, and then moving in the direction of a theory and models and techniques for achieving exceptional mental health and what that might entail. So that's where I would like to pick up today. This is about one half of the mission statement for the Santa Barbara Institute, really working on the theme of eudaimonia, which I will refer again just in a moment. We're trying to conceive of mental health, break it down into constituent elements, see how to identify them, see how they might be cultivated, and then I'm working with various teams of cognitive scientists at UC Davis, UCLA, Stanford, and UCSF, working about devising means of actually measuring plasticity, psychoneuroplasticity, in terms of developing the various elements of mental health, as we'll see in this presentation. So, we're starting here. I'm not going to try to answer this question right now, but I think it is a fundamental question as we even raise the issue of mental health and human flourishing, is what are we dealing with? What kind of a hand are we dealt? And so we see here's one major hypothesis, and we get this both from the Judeo-Christian tradition, especially the Protestant tradition, rather a dark view of human beings being a den of iniquity, basically in pretty sorry cases in need of absolute outside redemption. Neurotic, we get this from Freud and many others, that this is our essential nature. We're pretty screwed up. So what we're looking for is a manageable degree of neuroses rather than an unmanageable degree of psychoses. And selfish, we're getting this from evolutionary biology, that this is really how we're programmed, which raises an anomaly of why human beings, especially and perhaps uniquely, human beings are ever altruistic to anybody outside of their kin group, or their particular group, like their pack, their tribe, or what have you. And it's a problem that may very well be solved, but I think is not yet solved. Probably, according to an article I just read in Scientific American Mind, it's probably some type of interface between genes and cultural environment that brings this forth. At least that's the best scientific shot at this moment. On the other hand, we also find from the Judeo-Christian tradition, human beings are created in the image of God. How bad could that be? And so there's an image of something that is good. Matthew Fox has developed that a lot, a Christian theologian. Sanity and caring. Again, that would be part and parcel of this. And this second one we'll see, we'll find a lot of reflections of that or expressions of this in various contemplative traditions. But before going to the Buddhist view, the vision of mental health, very much based in Buddhism, I'd like to go back to our own culture, because I'm finding here in the writings of Aristotle a theme that was quite widespread in early Greek thought, which was adopted over into early Christian thought. The notion of eudaimonia. Etymologically, it means good spirit, or good demon, good spirit. And so, but I love this definition that Aristotle has given. Number one, I think it's meaningful in and of itself, but I think it's also a good segue to understanding where the kind of the Buddhist approach to human flourishing, mental well-being, mental health. So here's what he comments on this regard, that eudaimonia, or human flourishing, is a common, probably best translation, is equivalent to the human good. It is the good life. And it comes to be disclosed as a being at work of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if the virtues are more than one, in accordance with the best and most complete virtue. I find that marvelously rich. Part of that, like our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth, is that they're making a statement. This is not a wishy-washy kind of bland generalization. He's definitely coming to something, but is open if there are more than one virtue. The highest virtue, well, take your pick. You may be drawing from the field of positive psychology, or from Aristotle, or from Augustine, from Buddhism, from Christianity, from Judaism, and the list goes on. But I think this is a very good kind of launching pad to conceive of human flourishing and mental health as a being at work of the soul. That is, it's not an endpoint where you would say, like the kids wait in the car on a long vacation, are we there yet? Are we there yet? But rather a process, just that. We are in process. Are you in a process of cultivating human flourishing, and not what time is it, what day is it, have we arrived yet? So I find that very useful. There we go. The virtues. I'm going to go back to another of my favorite thinkers from the West. In terms of self-knowledge, certainly self-knowledge should be one of the virtues. I imagine it must be one of the virtues. And an interesting statement by Socrates, especially in light of the development of modern science, from the time of Copernicus on, when he writes, I'm still, or he states, since he didn't write, everything we have, I'm still unable, as the Delphic inscription orders, namely, know thyself, to know myself. And it really seems to me ridiculous to look into other things before I have understood that. So if there is such a thing as mental health, and exceptional mental health, well-being that's derived from mental health, clearly self-knowledge has to be an integral component of that. And both of these themes, both from Aristotle and Socrates, are very much deeply ingrained from the beginning in Buddhism. So the meaning of life, or the emotion of our life, from the contemporary prominent thinker in the Buddhist tradition, namely the current Dalai Lama. He writes at the beginning of his book that he co-authored, The Happiness. I believe that the very purpose of our life is to seek happiness. Whether one believes in religion or not, whether one believes in this religion or that religion, we all are seeking something better in life, so I think the very motion of our life is toward happiness. This is not a trivial pursuit as he's presenting it. It's not just trying to devise a game plan so you can bounce from one pleasurable stimulus to another, cunningly get around all of the unpleasant things like aging, sickness, and death, let alone adversity of all kinds. It's not a matter of how clever you can be of avoiding unfavorable or unpleasant situations and lucking out and just striking one happy situation after another. Rather, it's a matter of internal transformation that taps into, in a word, something beyond what I would call stimulus-driven pleasure. And I have nothing against that. I'm as much a Haagen-Dazs fan as anybody else, but there may be something beyond stimulus-driven pleasures. And that's what Buddhism is really concerned with. So if we go into the large picture, and an enormous amount that we said here, and I will keep my words very, very brief, there is a large overall structure of Buddhist practice, Buddhist theory and practice, and this pretty much summarizes everything. So it's kind of nice, one aspect about Buddhism, even though it's immensely elaborate, it's a 2,500-year-old tradition, and it's prospered and been assimilated in a wide variety of cultures from Afghanistan to Korea, and now California. Nevertheless, despite all of its internal complexity and elaborations and diversity, this basic framework really does stand. And that is the foundation of all Buddhist practice, and I think I would not be timid about saying the foundation of any type of spiritual practice. I would even go beyond that. Any meaningful life whatsoever is ethics. Now, I'm not going to fill in on much of that because, of course, there are different views of it. But I think the Buddhist rule of thumb is a good one to start with, or at least respond to, and that is ethics is leading a way of life in which, to the best of your ability, you avoid inflicting unnecessary harm on yourself or others. And you do whatever you can to be of service, to facilitate the well-being, the true flourishing or eudaimonia of oneself and others. So the golden rule pretty much boils down to that. And then you can elaborate it in any tradition you like, be it religious or non-religious. And that's really the core of it. And in Buddhism, when we speak of ethics, it pertains to behavior of body, speech, and mind. But for example, in Buddhist communities, and I was, as Leslie mentioned, I was a monk for 14 years, ethics is really the bedrock of a monastic community. If you don't know how to treat each other decently, you cannot have a community. So this first point would be really the Buddhist response to Freud and his civilization and its discontents. how can we possibly live together and not be clawing each other's eyes out? There is a strategy, and it's called ethics. And by cultivating that, even though it explicitly does pertain to our physical, that is how we physically interact, our verbal and our mental behavior, when you come to community, the primary emphasis, lo and behold, is on physical and verbal. Buddhist monks have a lot of precepts. All of the precepts pertain to physical and verbal behavior. There's not a single precept about don't think this, have this attitude, don't have that attitude. So insofar as our physical and our verbal way, the manifest ways we engage with each other, that these are conducive to each other's well-being, something can emerge from that as a derivative, and that is what I would call social flourishing. We can get along and actually be happy living with each other. But it boils down to fundamental ethics. If you can add on these two later components of Buddhist practice, all the better. But even if you can't, ethics will do. And if you don't have ethics, nothing will do. It doesn't matter how good you are at psychological techniques or meditative practices and so forth. If ethics is missing, and you all know this in a clinical setting, in a medical setting, without ethics, then you've got nothing at all, except for lawsuits. And so there's the foundation. Mental balance, I'm going a little bit slow, so I'll be very briefer here. Mental balance is going to be the gist of this presentation this morning. And so I'll say virtually nothing about it right now, but I would suggest that mental balance, by cultivating the mind, overcoming mental imbalances of a variety of sorts, that we can achieve a psychological flourishing that is more inward and that is not contingent upon living with others. I'm sure many of you saw the recent article or a large issue of Time magazine devoted to the science of happiness. They have multiple articles on positive psychology coming from Richie Davidson's work on affective neuroscience to a variety of other topics or approaches. But I was struck by one comment in particular, and drawing heavily from Martin Seligman's work, that this well-being, the sense of flourishing, of happiness, comes when we're engaged with each other. But as soon as you're alone, it says then it cascades down. So the type of mental flourishing of authentic happiness, Martin Seligman's word, that is being cultivated or emphasized in the modern movement of positive psychology is largely treating us as social animals, social creatures. So we're flourishing with each other. Well, fair enough. A lot of our lives are spent with each other. But a quality of well-being that immediately goes into decay as soon as you're by yourself, I would suggest doesn't have a very deep root system. And so, to my mind, quite clearly, the optimal would be to cultivate qualities of mind, mental habits, mental balance that are applicable while engaging with others, whether it's with one's own spouse, family, one's work colleagues, in the business place, but also carry you through in times of solitude. Illness, aging, death, we are bound to be solitary on occasion. So that is a really central feature. Now, I would say almost like a backbone, the central core of Buddhist practice. And then the cherry on the cake, so to speak, which I'll refer to only very lightly, because we don't have enough time, is really considered to be the cutting edge of Buddhist practice, and that is the cultivation of contemplative insight, knowledge, self-knowledge, knowledge of the nature of the mind, knowledge of the nature of consciousness, which is said to have a liberating quality to it. So, I mean, I would put, in the Buddhist context, I put two great aphorisms together. Know thyself, the truth shall make you free. So those are from the Delphic Oracle in the New Testament. But Buddhism would say, well, we can put those in the same basket because they're profoundly related. There is a type of knowledge that liberates, and it's a knowledge of who we are. But now to slow down a little bit, here are four elements. All of these are drawn from the Buddhist tradition, although if you go into traditional Buddhist literature and say, well, where's a book on Buddhist mental health that unpacks the four elements, you're not going to find it. But all of this is inspired by, and I can show you exactly where it traces back to, traditional, authoritative Buddhist tradition and Buddhist literature. So I will refer to them only briefly now, but we'll slowly unpack these. I hope we do have time for discussion, because as far as I can tell, I'm quite satisfied with this, which is a sign of danger. It strikes me that, number one, for a long time, for a year or two, I was just thinking of three, the latter three, but then something was nagging at me. And I thought, no, we really need this first one. In fact, the first one is first. So there is a certain sequence in these four. Conative, of course, has a Latin root, but what conative as in conation, as many of you, I'm sure, know, pertains to the faculty of desire and volition. So it's getting our desires right, okay? being able to monitor our desires and give our energy, identify with and pursue desires that are truly conducive to our own and others' well-being. So again, we'll unpack that. Attentional balance is just the opposite of ADHD, deficit and hyperactivity, and I'll unpack that. Cognitive imbalances, ways that we simply misconstrue reality because of false superimpositions or being cognitively absent without leave, AWOL. And then the emotional balance is a word that actually does mean something in English, and I'll unpack that in the Buddhist context in a few moments. But let's go into these now in some detail. The model I'm using of deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunction, basic format that I'm going to apply to all of these, is taken right out of traditional Tibetan medicine, and that was a topic I addressed about 4 or 5 years ago when I was here. I won't elaborate on traditional Tibetan medicine, but I find this very useful here. I'm taking their model and applying this to mental health. So a cognitive deficit, apathetic loss of desire for happiness and its causes, where people give up. They may give up for a variety of reasons: loss of a spouse, illness, losing one's vitality, one's stamina as one gets older, tragedy, adversity, a tsunami, suddenly discovering one's had cancer, and the list goes on and on and on. It might be childhood trauma. I mean, there are a myriad of reasons why one might, frankly, simply give up and either be suicidal, quasi-suicidal, or just go on sheer maintenance. I'm here to survive, and that's the extent of my vision. But no vision at all of actually flourishing as a human being. There was a term for this in medieval Christianity. This is a Greek term, akadia, and it's often translated as spiritual sloth. Spiritual sloth. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have no desires, but your desires are directed towards things that don't have a chance in hell of giving you any real happiness. So, well, like a cocaine addict is very, very keen on cocaine, but the chances of finding any true happiness out of that are pretty much zero. So, just a lack of desire. It is an enormous mistake to think that Buddhism idealizes having no desires at all. It ain't so. It never has been so. Because then you wouldn't even want to practice Buddhism. Say, I can beat you to the pump, or to the, what do they say, beat you to the what? Punch. Punch, there you go. Beat you to the punch. I won't practice Buddhism, I'll already have no desires. And just flake out right there. Well, that's never been an ideal of Buddhism. But nor cognitive hyperactivity, where one has obsessive desires that obscure the reality of the present. And so you can see this can be in a myriad of ways, including in Buddhist practice, meditative practice. One may be so overcome by desire that you're actually not doing the task very well. Because you're thinking about the fruits, you're thinking about consequences, you're embroiled in desire rather than just getting down and getting the job done. Cognitive dysfunction is tragically all too common. Desire for things that are not conducive to one's own or others' well-being, and a classic case that immediately springs to mind is addiction. So one may have a lot of desire, but whether it's addiction to substance abuse, or whether it's to sex, or whether it's to money, there are a lot of things that in and of themselves may not be problematic. I mean, money is not a bad thing, or fame or wealth are not bad things. But if one focuses on that and takes that as the very core of one's well-being, let alone things that are truly harmful, then you have a problem. So there's a classic statement by an 8th century Buddhist sage to the effect that while we seek to escape suffering, we pursue the very causes of suffering, and while we seek to find happiness, we destroy the causes of our happiness as if they were our foes. I find that is a timelessly true statement, still all too true in my own life. So when I speak of this, of course, I'm not speaking to people who have checked themselves into a psychiatric clinic because they cannot function in society. But rather, the Buddhist notion here is this is a spectrum from people who are utterly incapacitated because of psychosis to people who are perfectly enlightened. But the rest of us, all of the rest of us, are somewhere in that spectrum, and we're probably slipping around, like wandering around on an ice skating rink, slipping towards sanity, slipping back from sanity, towards and back, and hopefully, in the Buddhist view, shuffling in a kind of a zigzag, one step forward, half step back, and so forth, shuffling towards greater and greater sanity. So, cognitive balance, I would say that if one is to the extent that one is cognitively imbalanced in any of these 3 ways, one cannot be deemed mentally healthy. My bold statement. If you're cognitively imbalanced, you're not mentally balanced. That is too crucial to be able to cast it out. So there's an enormous emphasis on this in Buddhism as in other traditions. This is a very, very brief response to it, but it's not only that the problem is identified, but then in broad strokes, and this can be unpacked in enormous detail, remedy apathy by arousing a recognition of the possibility of genuine happiness, that we can do more than merely survive. Obsessive desire with cultivation of contentment, and remedy mistaken desire through recognition of true causes of genuine happiness. True causes, too, are vulnerability to suffering. So again, those are just thumbnail sketches, kind of indicators, but this has to be unpacked. And of course, the West has an enormous amount to offer here, and so does the Buddhist tradition, I believe. This is an area of special interest of mine for many, many years now, the cultivation of attentional balance, which is overcome by, or that is achieved by overcoming imbalances. This actually was the topic of my dissertation when I was at Stanford in religious studies, but it was really all about training attention, which now is finally coming into the purview of cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience. These people have been studying attention for a long time. Astonishingly, to my mind, they have not been studying much in the way of plasticity of attention, especially for normal and above. So now there's a growing amount, a lot of research being done on ADHD, showing how attention is plastic going down, how you can fall from normal to subnormal. But once you're normal, is there any possibility of developing exceptional states of attentional balance? And if that were possible, what are the benefits? Well, I'm working on a whole research project with a team at UC Davis to explore that in some depth. But the Buddhist framework for this is basically that of laxity and excitation, but these correspond really quite closely to the modern markers of deficit and hyperactivity. So the major imbalances, and again the same format, deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunction. Deficit is a loss of clarity and vividness of attention. In the Buddhist parlance, this is regarded as like an implosion of awareness. Right now I'm attending to you very vigilantly. You see my body language, I'm coming out. My mind is coming out to meet you. And now watch what happens. That was my little play. Watching how the attention, rather than being focused, clear, and attentive, implodes into kind of a stupor. First loss of clarity, then a lethargy of dullness, spaced out, and then sleepiness, and then falling asleep. So it's a slippery slope. This is one of the major indicators, especially among women, girls, for ADHD. They tend to be more prone to deficit, whereas boys tend to be more prone to hyperactivity, by a pretty large margin. Hyperactivity is just the opposite of implosion, it's explosion, a fragmentation, involuntary agitation and distraction driven by compulsive desires, of just the mind lacking any kind of ballast or stability. So the mind may be constantly fragmented, going out to sensory objects, stimuli, or just getting caught up in a maze of internal thinking that's just all over the map. Inability to focus and maintain any kind of sustained continuity of attention. So hyperactivity. This also, well, I'll mention this in the third one, attentional dysfunction, a way attending in afflictive ways. Now, individuals who look at other people as purely sexual objects, that would be one case. People in business who look at human beings as basically what they call prey. Is, here's an individual, how much money could I get from you? Well, this is dehumanizing, literally. Think about that to a slot machine or the automatic teller, how much money can I get from you? But to do that to human beings, degrading to oneself and others. But there's another thing that was recently brought to my attention, is I'm working with a whole group at UCLA to adapt meditative practices for the prevention and treatment of ADHD. And another type of attentional dysfunction, which is not really excitation or laxity, is what they call hyperattention. And this happens in ADHD, where individuals will get so hyper-focused involuntarily, hyper-focused, that the mind closes down, develops a kind of tunnel vision, which is, in many cases, not suitable, not effective. You can't be a good driver, for example, if you develop tunnel vision, have no idea what's happening on the sides of your automobile behind, forget what happens about your dashboard, because you're totally focused on something else. So that would be a dysfunctional type of attention, where you compulsively have this tunnel vision, and you're locked in, and you cannot maintain a plasticity or a suppleness of attention. So, briefly stated, we're doing okay for the time. Here's where Buddhism, I think, comes in with great strength, really quite extraordinary strength. And again, we're working on a one-year program to study this, a one-year residential program where 30 people will be training for 8 to 10 hours a day. And we'll do a longitudinal study, both from brain imaging, EEG, ERP, cognitive behavioral measures, all for attention, and a number of other measures coming from social psychology to study the interface between attentional development and emotional regulation and see how these two interface. Because clearly they do. There are a lot of emotional disruptions, imbalances that stem from or relate to ADHD. So if these are the two are related, attentional balance and emotional balance on the downside, which they clearly are, then it would be quite natural to assume or to expect that emotional regulation and attentional balance are also going to be related as you're developing or exercising the plasticity of the mind and looking for things that are above normal. Mindfulness does have different definitions, so I don't mean to imply that this is the only one. In the context of attentional training in Buddhism, I'm bracketing this very carefully, because John Kabat-Zinn will have a somewhat different definition, which I totally respect. It's just coming from a different context within Buddhism. Here, for the training of attention, mindfulness in this context is defined, and this is coming out of the classic text, the ability to sustain voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. Now, upon a familiar object, bear in mind, object here is being used in the broadest possible sense of the term. An object may be tactile sensations at the tip of your nose as you're breathing. An object may be a whole room full of people. An object may be an entire sensory field. An object may be a field, it may be a point, it may be a situation, it may be a conversation, it may be another person's body language. That is, it's whatever you direct your attention to, but whatever you direct it to voluntarily, being able to sustain a coherence, a temporal coherence, a continuity, a cohesion of being present. Mindfulness. You're full of mind, as opposed to being in and out or fluctuating and so forth. Mindfulness is crucial, but there's something that often doesn't get much play in the press, and that is what I'm translating here as meta-attention. In the Buddhist context, shijin, introspection, metacognition, but here very specifically meta-attention. This is the ability to monitor the quality of your attention, swiftly recognizing whether it has succumbed to any of the imbalances, excitation, or laxity. This is minding the store, and that is knowing, being able to monitor from moment to moment, is my mind focused, coherent, attentive? Am I slipping into the implosion of laxity? Am I slipping into the explosion of excitation? It's quality control, like in a factory. Produce your product, but somebody better be watching to see whether the product is coming out well. And so this is a metacognitive ability to monitor the quality of your attention from moment to moment. More broadly speaking, this is tapping into an enormously important faculty, which I hope will get a lot more play in the positive psychology literature. And that is, more broadly speaking, the ability to monitor our mental states, mental processes, not just attention. But when the mind falls into a significant imbalance of any sort, be able to recognize that. If we, I'll take an example that's not in any of my 4 categories per se. How about pettiness? Pettiness, I'm not exactly sure where that would fall. Maybe a mixture of emotional and cognitive imbalance. But pettiness, we all know what it's like. And if you're at all like me, you know that you still succumb to it on occasion, where we make a big deal out of something that's very small and really quite trivial. The ability to recognize, my mind has become petty. I've become small-minded. I'm getting flustered by trivial things. To be able to recognize that. Not just be immersed in it, but recognize it. And in a non-judgmental way. It's kind of like saying, I've got a wart, or I'm feeling a stomachache. This is not being judgmental, like I've got a bad body, I'm a bad person. It's just that, I have stomach upset, I probably shouldn't drink a quart of ice cold Coca-Cola right now. So it's not being judgmental, it's being attentive, it's being mindful, and then recognizing if, for example, right now, I'm becoming petty, recognize maybe now would be a good time not to talk a lot. Or to lash out at other people who are rubbing me the wrong way. Why are you crossing your legs like that? That's really not respectful in the Tibetan tradition. Well, that would be a real case of pettiness. Okay. But this metacognition, a friend of mine out at UCSF, David Gallen, has written an excellent article just showing how metacognition is a crucial faculty, and if that is impaired, it's actually more debilitating to mental health than being blind or deaf. It is a crucial faculty. And then the issue of plasticity is raised. Can that be cultivated? If it can be, that will be tremendously to our advantage. Moving right on to cognitive imbalances. Cognitive deficit, same format. Failure to perceive what is present in the 6 fields of experience. Very consciously 6 fields, because it's silly to think we all have only 5 senses. Because we do have a 6th, and it's not a 3rd eye, it's not occult or mystical. It's a mode of perception that I'm astonished is not mentioned in cognitive psychology textbooks that I've looked at. I will call it very blandly mental perception. And that is it is the ability to immediately experience, perceive, detect, observe mental processes and states. So right now, is your mind agitated or calm? Are you angry or happy? Are you the list goes on and on and on of just an immediate experience of this metacognitive ability to monitor, and that really is to observe mental states and processes. So right now, are you angry or are you calm? Well, you don't infer this by looking at your body and say, well, I'm still, I must be calm. Because people can be seething in anger and sit there and they're about to blow up, but there will be nothing in their behavior. And certainly we don't know about our mental states by knowing about our brains, because we don't from moment to moment. We don't walk around with an fMRI latched to our backs, as if we could have a back that strong. And so cognitive deficit is being absent in the present moment, whether it's in a conversation, whether it's driving, whether it's playing tennis, whether it's being a chess player, where something has presented itself is clearly in the midst of your domain of experience, of your five physical senses, your mental faculty of mental perception. It is present, it's available. It's not hidden, obscured, subtle, esoteric. It's right there in your face, and you don't notice it. A person tells you something in conversation, please remember this, it's gone. Don't even pick it up. A person is displaying a certain type of body language, don't even notice it. A person is clearly unhappy, don't even notice it. You yourself are clearly unhappy. If you just looked, you would notice you're really miserable, but you don't even notice. How are you? Doing great. Or you're terribly angry, and you cover it up and say, no, I'm not angry. Not at all angry. And everybody else knows you're angry, and you don't know you're angry. You've missed something in the 6th domain of experience that other people are picking up inferentially, by body language, facial expression, tone of voice, or even content. It's an enormous issue. And when it goes out to an extreme, we call it psychosis. Cognitive hyperactivity, push that out to extreme, we call it psychosis, schizophrenia, and the like, where there's a conflation of conceptual projection with perceptual experience. We do it all the time. This is not just for people in the mental world. This is what mindfulness is clearly designed to counteract. Both of these. Mindfulness is a major key for both of these. But that is where we are conflating our expectations, our anticipations, our beliefs, our desires, and so forth and so on, spraying these conceptually on perceptual fields of experience, conflating them, and then walking around with a delusional notion of what happened. But I'm sure you said this. Hearing people say things they never said, that I'm sure you said it. No. I mean, it happens to me sometimes. I thought you said this, and one indicator I know that they're wrong is not only I never said it, I never even thought that. And either I'm suffering from a really severe cognitive deficit, or they're suffering from a cognitive hyperactivity disorder, of hearing things that weren't said, and so forth. And likewise, we can do this for ourselves, thinking we are wondrously altruistic, because we just wrote a big check for something, and then we advertise it to the world. Notice how much money I gave. Well, we think I'm being very altruistic. In fact, we're being very egotistical, because that check was a launching pad to increase our resume, our reputation, win other people's desire, admiration, and affection, and so forth. So hyperactivity in all 6 fields. Cognitive dysfunction really, I think, is derivative out of the previous 2, where we just get it wrong. That is, we misapprehend what's taking place. How would that happen? By deficit and hyperactivity. Probably some unholy conjunction of those 2. Unholy in the sense of unsane. So I think sanity goes back to the word whole. But mindfulness is really the key to this, of overcoming all 3 of these types of cognitive imbalances, the cultivation of mindfulness, the refinement of mindfulness. And as the Theravada Buddhist tradition strongly emphasizes, it's more than just being present. It is a cultivation of a discerning mindfulness. It is highly discerning. It's not judgmental in the sense of slamming like, don't like, good, and bad, but it is very attentive, it's intelligent, it's discerning. And then the Buddhist framework of this, the matrix of practice is called the 4 applications, or 4 foundations of mindfulness. in which one attends systematically and very meticulously to one's own body, experienced from a first-person perspective. But often this is overlooked. It's not only attending to one's own body, it's attending to one's own body, discerning mindfulness, and of course this is unpacked in an enormous amount of detail. It's also attending to the bodies of others. So we allude back to Paul Ekman's work in emotional expressions of emotions and so forth. This is all really as he's teaching people, police forces and so forth, how to recognize lying. Well, he's not teaching them how to be clairvoyant. What he is teaching them is the application of mindfulness to the body. Facial expression, subtle expression, minute expressions, very, very brief micro expressions. To be able to read these, and on that basis to infer honesty, dishonesty, anxiety, sadness, fear, the 6 or 7 fundamental emotions, and he's got, and his work, Emotions Revealed, come out with some very, very precise typologies here and ways of recognizing emotions, well, by way of the body. So the Buddhist application of mindfulness to the body is to one's own, taking in your own body from the first-person perspective, attending vigilantly and intelligently to the bodily presence of others, and then the third key to this, and it goes through all 4 of these, is attending both inwardly and outwardly. That is, as I'm observing your body, for example, I'm not just observing your body, because you're nodding right now, but you're nodding not because you just have a twitch, but you're nodding to what I'm saying. So what I'm saying, in fact, is response to my physical presence here, my verbal presence, but my verbal presence now is responding to your bodily expressions. So we have a matrix here now, and now we can attend to this interaction, internal, external, and external. How am I impacting my physical environment, namely the bodily expressions of those around me? It's pretty cool. It's very nuanced. So, and then moving on very rapidly now, attending to feelings, which you can directly observe in ourselves and inferentially observe in others. Or I think it's more than that. I think there's something of empathy, there's something of intuition that is not a flat-out kind of left hemispherical, prefrontal cortex, kind of like logical kind of thing. I think when a mother empathizes with the feelings of her child, she's not doing something that is highly cognitive, she's doing something that's profoundly empathetic. And that is also attending to the feelings of others, but in a way that probably is not following the classic roots of Aristotelian logic. Feelings, mental states and processes, crucially important, and then just opening up the domain of mindfulness to phenomena at large. And then we move on to emotional imbalances. And again, each of these can be unpacked in a tremendous amount of detail. We're working with a very, very old and a very elaborate tradition here. And it's been working on these themes for a very long time. Emotional deficit. Again, no big mystery here. Emotional balance is a term we do use in the West already, whereas attentional, cognitive, and cognitive balance may be not household terms at this point. Emotional balance is, emotional deficit is not the same as cognitive deficit, having no desires. It's emotionally being dead. Just as we say, out of touch with one's emotions, or maybe you are in touch with them and they're rather dead. There's no liveliness to them, an emotional deadness within, but in terms of our interpersonal relationship, a cold indifference to people and events. One is simply not moved by other people's successes or their tragedies. One is like emotionally anesthetized in a myriad of ways that can happen. Emotional hyperactivity, I would say, is one more indication of mental imbalance. Excessive oscillations from elation and depression, so bipolar, when it gets really clinical, bipolar, but again, I would, on all of these points, I would say there's a smooth spectrum. Psychosis, neurosis, mental health, exceptional mental health, enlightenment. Most of us, certainly myself, we are slip-sliding somewhere in the middle, or at least between Buddhahood and psychosis. It's pretty safe there. Likewise, excessive oscillations between hope and fear. It's a big issue in spiritual practice, in contemplative practice. Sit down and meditate. Just do it. Don't get hung up on the fruits of your work, but it goes for everything else. Cultivating a relationship with another person, maybe a burgeoning romance. Just be present. Don't always get hung up on how it may or may not turn out in the future. Adulation and contempt, big one. And it can be very excessive. And then attachment and anger. Attachment in the sense of afflictive attachment, not attachment as in social psychology where it's something very benign. So self-centered attachment, self-centered craving, as opposed to anger, where in the Buddhist framework, I think it's very meaningful, certainly to me, that in afflictive attachment, one is identifying an object, another person, a job, a situation, a status, an amount of money, and so forth, and locking onto this saying, that object, tangible or intangible, that is the very locus of my happiness. My happiness is my family, which means if the family gets wiped out in an automobile accident, you've got nothing. It would be an externalization, and I think sometimes often a disastrous externalization of the source of one's well-being. As soon as one places it on an object, even a spouse, family, let alone job, reputation, financial security, and that kind of thing. This is afflictive. But in a similar way that we can externalize the source of happiness, which is, I think, always a mistake, we can also externalize the source of our unhappiness. Saying, I'm unhappy because of my spouse, or my teenage son, or my job, or my boss, or I don't have enough money, or people don't like me. And the finger's whipping out in every direction except for where it should go. And that is where the other four fingers are directed, back to oneself. So this would be an indication of emotional hyperactivity, and then emotional dysfunction, simply having utterly inappropriate responses to whatever comes up. Taking delight in somebody else's misfortune, somebody you don't like in the workplace, and the person gets disgraced, and feeling some jubilation in response. Or a person experiences something wonderful, maybe a very happy marriage, and one responds with envy because one's own marriage is falling apart. So it's not a matter of death or hyperactivity, it's dysfunction. I would say now for all four of these, cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional, if in any of these four areas, or I would say to the extent that, because it's not binary, to the extent that one is mentally imbalanced in any of these four ways, I would say you're not mentally balanced. You're not mentally healthy, to the extent that. Now, as I said, I am dangerously content with four. If you can, as professionals in this field, if you can alert me to something that is vitally important, that is not derivative of any of these four, that requires us to add a fifth, you say, but if you're missing this, you're really mentally imbalanced. I'm all ears. This is my best shot so far. And the cognitive was the most recent addition. And again, an enormous amount can be said in terms of proactive ways of cultivating emotional balance in the Buddhist context. Here is one core matrix of practices: the cultivation of the heart, cultivating loving kindness, the heartfelt aspiration that oneself and others may find happiness through causes of happiness, compassion, the heartfelt yearning that oneself and others may be free of suffering and the causes of suffering, empathetic joy, taking delight in others' successes and in the causes of their success, and equanimity, which is really developing an unconditionality in one's emotional responses to others. That is, the affection goes out beyond people who are of one's own tribe, your family, your workplace, people belonging to your political party, and so forth and so on. That it really goes out evenly without discriminating. Well, these people I don't care about, but these people are my friends. That is more of a sense of impartiality in one's distribution or the delivery system of loving kindness, compassion, and empathetic joy. There's an enormous amount more than that. But I find a certain majesty or elegance in the way these four interrelate. Because, for example, when empathetic joy goes astray, it turns into hedonism. Hedonism is remedied by the cultivation of loving kindness, which is attending to genuine happiness and its causes, as opposed to mere stimulus-driven pleasures. And so these two, one can actually remedy the other when it goes astray. Aloof indifference can happen when equanimity goes astray. Equanimity is very wholesome. Impartiality is very wholesome, but it may go astray into kind of an emotional deficit of cold indifference. To the extent that we fall into that, people are watching the news and we're hearing about the tsunami victims for 2 weeks in a row, and after a while the heart just turns off and says, I don't want to hear anymore. It's 250,000 people and I don't have that much money, and I don't care anymore. That would be an afflictive response to it. How do we overcome that? Because we don't want to be slipping into that in a habitual way. Go back to compassion. Attending to what's the reality here. So the compassion balances out equanimity when it goes astray into aloof indifference. Compassion can go astray into depression. Depression, it may be very local. Your child is dying of an illness. Or it may be local, or it may be the tsunami, it may be something global. counteract depression with the active cultivation of empathetic joy. Maintain balance, as the Dalai Lama so often commented, in terms of depression, to the extent that we fall into despair, hopelessness, then we make ourselves ineffective for bringing about any benefit in the world. No matter what the extent of tragedy is, if we fall into despair, then we make ourselves useless. And I think many of you know a loved one coming to a person in the hospital and then weeping at the bedside and say, "I'm so sorry for you, it just breaks my heart," and then being overcome in a flood of tears is not generally helpful for the patient. We would like something, please give me plan B, something besides that. Remedying depression with empathetic joy and self-centered attachment when loving kindness goes astray. It can give rise to loving kindness for me and mine, for my wife, my child, but not the next door neighbor. Or Buddhists, but not Christians. Or religious people, but not those secular people, and so forth and so on. This is all self-centered concern or caring, and you overcome that with equanimity. So again, a lot can be unpacked, but I find that really quite an extraordinary matrix, interrelated matrix of practice. Happily, we're right on time here. I'd like to come back to the initial topic, and that is human nature, but now try to assess, in light of the foregoing presentation, what's the Buddhist take on this? So I wasn't just going to let that dangle. What is the Buddhist take? And the Buddhist take is that our habitual state, the habitual state of a mentally imbalanced mind, of an afflicted mind, is one of dissatisfaction and unease. To the extent that we are suffering from any of the above four types of mental imbalance, what's the symptom? It doesn't feel good. Our minds are not prone to dissatisfaction, unhappiness, restlessness, malaise, boredom, anxiety, and so forth, simply because we're human. If a therapist told me that, "Alan, you're feeling unhappy, after all, it's human nature, and you are human after all, go home," I would do the classic response and say, "I'd like to get a second opinion, please." Because it's really an utterly unsatisfactory answer, because it leads to no research. It gives rise to no agenda, no program, no research. So to say it's human nature is kind of like a dead end as far as I'm concerned. To the extent that the mind is imbalanced, as in the case, to the extent that you're in a state of humoral imbalance in traditional Tibetan medicine, or cholesterol imbalance, or dopamine imbalance, or the list goes on and on and on, to the extent that the body is systemically in a state of imbalance, it doesn't feel good, and it's supposed to not feel good. Evolutionary biology has given us a big boost there. The body doesn't feel great when it's ill. Otherwise, we would never attend to it. We say, "I feel fine, why should I worry?" And then we die prematurely and so forth. So it's a wonderful thing, in many cases, that the body, when it's injured or in a state of imbalance, gives us the symptoms, alerts us so that we respond to it, and hopefully there's some remedy. I would say similarly, the state that the mind naturally gravitates to when it's not being pumped up with some type of stimulation, music, conversation, workaholicness, entertainment, thrill sports, excessive, what do they call it, excessive sports or something like that, all of these kind of things. Extreme sports, there we go, excessive sports, extreme sports, elevator music. I mean, what happens to the mind when it's deprived, even temporarily, from stimuli? Like spend a morning in solitary confinement. And what happens to the mind? Hang out in a sensory deprivation tank for about 6 hours. What happens to the mind? Just have to sit alone in a room, well-fed, in a room that's warm, and what happens to the mind? Well, the mind is likely to gravitate to its relative ground state, and insofar as that mind is subject internally to mental imbalances, it's going to feel pretty miserable. So if you've gotten yourself into a federal penitentiary, probably for something pretty nasty, and in that you do something so nasty you're put into solitary confinement, that is generally considered, since we don't generally torture people in this country, solitary confinement is about as bad as it gets. And who's torturing the person? Not the guards, because they're just putting you in that room by yourself and giving you enough to not be hungry, of boring food. And all the rest of the punishment is coming from within. That same situation of being put into a room and given adequate food is exactly what Tibetan contemplatives aspire to and give themselves 3-year terms, self-imposed, and come out, because I've known a number of people, and come out blissful, mentally balanced, and saying, "Can I go back for another term?" And sometimes multiple ones. It'd be like coming out of prison and say, give me a bank, I gotta rob a bank because I want to go back to solitude. So whether solitude in general, whether intense solitude, like solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, or being sealed in a meditation cave in Tibet, whether that's torture or whether it's bliss, is clearly not due to the environment. It is clearly due to the degree of mental balance one is bringing to that situation. It is having a mind with no anesthetic, with no buffer zone. And our modern society is extremely skillful in creating buffer zones to cloak our own minds from us. Because it overwhelms us with stimuli. The video games, the high intensity bombardment of television, the music that has to be so many decibels to be able to actually stimulate people to shroud their own mental imbalances, is my understanding. So my sense is that the more extreme the mental imbalance, the more extreme stimuli you need to have to overwhelm it so you can feel okay. Or, of course, the other major option is chemical. From nicotine to alcohol to Prozac to, you know the list better than I heard an astonishing statement from CNN, and I find it difficult to believe. But somebody whipped out the comment on CNN a couple of days ago that 43% of Americans take some type of mood-altering drug. I desperately hope that's not true, but if they're including caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol, that would be very safe. But if it's not including those, that sounds pretty tragic. Because we know that drugs can have an immediate, you don't have to work through music, through interpersonal relationships, you go right to the core centers in the brain to stifle the symptoms of mental imbalance, to blow them away with a chemical anesthetic. That is clearly a case of shooting the messenger, or stifling the symptom rather than getting to the core of the problem. So this is an habitual state. This we call the relative ground state. And insofar as the mind is imbalanced, then the extent to which we feel happy in the midst of mental imbalance, because we have a wonderful marriage, or we have a great hi-fi system or stereo system, or we have a great big plasma television, 52 inches or whatever, or we go for the extreme sports, or we go for workaholics. You're basically really mentally imbalanced and unhappy, but you forget about it because you're such a damn hard worker. The more intense, that is, whenever we find this relief from the symptoms of mental imbalance, all that really is an attenuation of the symptoms of an underlying problem. Take away the stimulus, fire the person. Take away the stimulus, whether it's music, sports, sex, conversation, whatever it is. Take it away, and wham! The symptoms of mental imbalance hit you in the face like a Mack truck. So we have really two strategies, and the West is the best when it comes to ingenuity of devising techniques for smothering the symptoms of mental imbalance. And I'm not just referring to medical profession with Prozac and all of that. I'm referring to the society at large with entertainment, sports, and more sports and entertainment and so forth. So that's one tack, is say that, well, I'm mentally imbalanced, but it's okay because I'm so ingenious in smothering the symptoms. Even at the end of the day, when my mind is attentionally imbalanced and cognitive all over the place, I'm just going to take something to make me fall asleep. And then I'll wake up in the morning and take something like caffeine to get me awake. And then I'll take Prozac to keep me modified, and I'll take Ritalin to keep that part modified, and on it goes. So basically turn yourself into a little chemical tank to smother all the symptoms of an underlying problem. The other possibility is to actually get to the source of the problem and take active measures, drawing from modern psychology, drawing possibly from Buddhism, to attend to the underlying imbalances and to rectify them. And this symptom, I say this with a lot of confidence, the symptom of mental balance is a sense of eudaimonia. We come back to where we started. A sense of well-being, a sense of flourishing that carries through times of adversity, through times of felicity, but is a symptom, as the symptom of a really healthy body is that it feels good. You go out and jog for 5 miles and the body feels nice and loose and warm and really warm and cuddly at the end of 5 miles. Or you can swim 100 laps, or you can do 40 push-ups, or just generally, the body, when it's healthy, it's balanced, it's well-tuned, good diet, good exercise, it feels good, assuming it's not injured. And the mind that is balanced, it feels good prior to the stimulation, prior to chemical stimulation, prior to sensory stimulation, prior to learned optimism, prior to learned attitudes, prior to learned intellectual or conceptual stimuli to try to lift your spirits. the mind is already not lifted, it is balanced, and it doesn't need to be lifted. Because the symptom of a balanced mind is that it feels good prior to all the stimulation that we give it from a myriad of sources. So the habitual state of an afflicted mind is one of dissatisfaction, unease, restlessness, anxiety. The Buddhists call it dukkha, which is the whole spectrum of suffering from malaise to anguish. Whereas the ground state of awareness in the Buddhist understanding, the Buddhist experience, is one of innate bliss, luminosity, and serenity. It is as they cut through the mental imbalances, cut through the habituation to a myriad of imbalances, cognitive and likewise. And the deepest state, the innate state, is one of bliss. It is one of the luminosity of awareness itself. It is a peace that surpasseth understanding, to draw from another tradition. And so that's the bad news and that's the good news. But you never get to the good news if you stifle the symptoms of the bad news. And I think that's probably not the last one. A meaningful life. Again, I'm going to be very bold, and that is to say, this seems to me dangerously satisfactory. It consists of an integrated pursuit of genuine happiness, as opposed to mere sensory, stimulus-driven pleasures, without which I think one is not pursuing a meaningful life. If happiness doesn't factor in, something crucial is important, is missing. A life that is in pursuit of truth, of understanding, of knowledge. If we're not pursuing that, something crucially is missing. And a life in pursuit of virtue. And I don't mean that in necessarily a moralistic or religious fashion. We all recognize virtues. There are excellent doctors. They may be secular, religious, or what have you, but there are excellent doctors. And their excellence is virtue. They care about their patient, they're intelligent, they're well-trained, they're empathetic. You know the list better than I. These are virtues. And some of them are contingent upon or related to professions, but fundamentally we're dealing with human virtues and we have a rather long list I think we can all agree upon. These are good things. And a good life cultivates the goodness of life, or virtues of life. And should there be more than one, then let that be on the top. Genuine happiness, I would say, is cultivated by mental balance in particular, by way of ethics, foundational mental balance or mental health, and then insight, know thyself especially, and then mental health, teasing this out of the previous triad, cultivated by means of those four types of balance. That's a Buddhist model of mental health. And if there's something that you, from your own expertise, your own background, you say, well, that's all very well, but you missed this, I'm really all ears. But it's now 9 o'clock, some of you may have other obligations, what have you. I don't, so I can take that.